Okay, so we know a new Halo TV series has been in the works for quite some time and is finally set to allegedly release sometime next year. We decided the best way to prepare for this series is to go back and watch every single Halo movie or limited series that has ever been released and somehow try to formulate our opinions and make a tier list based off of all of these forms of media. Now, Halo's interesting, of course, because we can't just look at this in the traditional sense of Halo movies in a series. There's just been two main things that are kind of like a movie, Forward Unto Dawn and Nightfall, which were all released in parts originally when they released, so you almost could look at them as a mini-series, but it's then later released as a movie. And then there's Halo Legends, which is a series of episodes that are presented more in an anthology type approach. And then along the way, there's been different animated series and promotional short films used for the Halo franchise. So we went through and we watched everything. Essentially, we wanted to make the ultimate not Halo video game or book tier list, so anything goes for our list. And to make things more complicated, we didn't go in any particular order. So we decided to start things off looking at the live action films with Halo Forward Unto Dawn, which was released as a mini-series slash film to promote Halo 4. And for the most part, we do remember watching this back in the day, and we remembered it being pretty boring. So we obviously had very high hopes jumping into this one. Okay, to be fair, this one was very interesting. Of course, this is the first feature-length foray into live-action Halo films, and yeah, they probably could have done a little bit better here in some parts. The story follows young Lasky from the video games as he's in training, which then leads up into him and the other cadets encountering the Covenant for the very first time. And I want to be fair. Originally, I remember this being incredibly boring, and it is. Don't get me wrong there. The thing with this movie is the entire first 75% or so of this film is just a lot of very slow moving exposition building up to an exciting last 20 minutes or so. And those 20 minutes or so are actually kind of fun and good. But seriously, the rest of the film is just some really unimportant and unnecessary interactions between Lasky and other cadets. There's a ton of Lasky just staring in this movie. Like, it's just the go-to shot that they use. He just stares and there's a blurry background behind him. Like, they focus the camera differently. And he's just staring. There's a little subplot with Lasky mourning the loss of his brother, and I guess this recurring theme of loss and sacrifice in war that maybe is supposed to play out into Halo 4, but if you're watching this for the plot, you're probably going to be disappointed because nothing really ends up going anywhere. The highlights of the film definitely lean more into the upbeat action sequences where we get to see the Master Chief or we get to see an elite being all creepy and stuff. At this point, there's a few moments of horror and tension, and it's actually done kind of well, making us wish this movie was anything else. But we're weighting this as a film beginning to end, and it's just so heavily weighted down by the beginning, it's going in D tier pretty easily. Though with the future of Halo, it seemed like we would see some sort of big project associated with every main Halo release over the years after Halo 4 released. For instance, when the Master Chief Collection released, we were introduced to another live-action Halo film, which was divided into episodes also, called Halo Nightfall, which actually starred Mike Coulter and was directed by Ridley Scott. It also had a $10 million budget with this project, so of course, the expectation here is going to be higher when we see a high budget like that and some big names being involved in the project. And for the most part, Nightfall does deliver an experience that's better than Forward Unto Dawn. The pacing isn't actually too bad. At the very least, if they were to release this episodically, things are moving more or less between each episode. We see some action right out of the beginning, and there is a moving story with some high intensity moments with conflicts between the characters that develops throughout the film, and the acting itself isn't that bad either. Some of the dialogue here and there does seem a little weird, but for the most part, everything is okay and passable at this point. perfect. Our main gripe with this film actually comes in the form of the fact that this is supposed to be a Halo movie, where outside of the one elite that makes an appearance in the beginning of the film, there's nothing really indicating that this is in fact a Halo movie. I guess there's a pelican briefly shown towards the end and they have some Halo weapons, but outside of that, it's literally just a generic space sci-fi film where they're on this mysterious planet, which in this case is the fragment of Installation 04, so it's not really a planet. And there's these evolved worm monsters that are apparently the same types of worms, maybe from the Hunters, but they evolved from the blast of the explosion of the Halo ring or something. Like we said, it really seemed like a generic sci-fi space movie that had an okay story that was just kind of injected with Halo plot to be like, yeah, this is Halo related, but never are we seeing action sequences that are reminiscent of something from the games. It's not a bad movie, it's an okay movie with some Halo themes thrown in on top of it, but it's also not an outstanding story to the point of the fact that we'd overlook that this seemingly has not very much to do with Halo. They literally could have replaced any of the elements with any other space game and the story would probably still be the same. Still, it was an improvement from Forward Unto Dawn, so we're gonna go ahead and put it in C tier here, one level higher than Forward Unto Dawn. And at the very least, at least we have some wiggle room to maybe get some interesting things going here. With Halo 5 Guardians release, we actually got a feature-length animated film based off of the Halo book, Fall of Reach. And just to start off with the few negatives that we do have about this one, the art style definitely isn't our favorite. Sometimes some of the sequences do feel a little bit lazy. I get that it's a catered art style and they were going for a specific art style, but sometimes we can't help but to wonder if the art style choice was actually the choice made to cover up the fact that maybe they didn't want to go through the animation process with some of the backdrops and settings. So one thing that is a little jarring, of course, is you would see a couple of characters that are fully animated in a scene, and then the background characters are static illustrations. And just sometimes it feels like characters are just walking around in a painting, which does take you out of the story a little bit. But when you're in the story, it's actually pretty good. It stays very, very truthful to the book adaptation, which is a huge plus point. But then it also does a couple of things to elaborate and expand on some of the things, or explain things in a more condensed and concise way that helps with the film's pacing. They essentially are trying to tell Master Chief's life story through an animated film here, and they do a good job at keeping themes that are important in Master Chief's younger years and show why they're still relevant into his maturity, while also telling kind of this overarching plot as well. And that definitely makes this film a winner. Sure, there are a few awkward sequences that are a little bit jarring, and at the end of the day, you can kind of just overlook them because of the quality that went into this one. Now, we were going to go ahead and put this in B tier. However, because of these two specific scenes...
Last one up gets it, Jorge!
My name's pronounced George.
Don't you backtalk me, Jorge!
we did promise it a guaranteed bump up one grade from whatever it would have landed in. So it is going up in A tier because those two scenes just carried the entire movie. So with two main movies down, we decided to turn our attention to the iconic Halo Legends series, which was an anthology set of animated episodes that essentially told different stories from the Halo universe. And these ones were quite interesting to go back and watch. So starting things off, we had Origins Part 1 and Part 2. Now, Origins Part 1 tells the interesting story of the early history of the Halo universe, focusing in mostly on Forerunners and the conflict with the Flood and the whole purpose of the rings in general. It's actually a really cool way to tell the story, and while a lot of the times we stand in the more skeptical ground when it comes to exploring too much of the Forerunners or making the Forerunners maybe too accessible and kind of killing the mystery of it, we felt like Origins 1 kind of walks a very thin line between overtelling and also keeping the mystery. So it wasn't actually that bad of a watch, and it was interesting in itself. Origins 2, on the other hand, focuses more on the human conflict throughout human history in the Halo timeline, and this one, while also staying in style of the first Origins, just wasn't as captivating or interesting the whole way through, but there wasn't necessarily anything explicitly or overtly bad about it either. So for part 1, we're going to go ahead and put this in B tier, and part 2 is going to just go one level lower in at C tier. Pretty middle of the road. Okay, we'll be straight up with this one. This is probably going to be a more controversial take on this video list, but when it comes to The Duel, we really were not fans of this episode whatsoever. So The Duel is this story of an old past arbiter who apparently refuses to accept the Covenant religion or something like that. The story is really hard to follow in itself, and while some people might really like exploring the lore of the Covenant, we feel like there's better ways of doing it than how The Duel was put together. Now, in general, the art style used here, you might think it's a really cool artistic choice, but the closer you look at it, the more you realize that it might not have actually been an artistic choice, but more just an artistic overlay to make it look artistic over some really low budget CGI. So a lot of the times the character models that are on screen, which are done in some level of CGI and then have this weird watercolor filter over it, look really weird, especially when the elites are talking, and it constantly takes you out of whatever is happening in the story. It just seems like their mouths are moving in a regular motion and their split jaw is like connected to their main hinge or whatever. I don't know the best way to explain it. It just looks really weird, and then we could overlook that if the story was at least interesting or relevant, and neither of those really seem to be the case. I think there could have been a really good story somewhere in the mess of this, but since we have to look at the entire scheme of every Halo type of film or episode release, this one's definitely one of the worst ones in our opinion, so we're going to put it all the way down in F tier. Then we can look to Homecoming as a very different and drastic change when we look at the scheme of episodes that were in Halo Legends. This one goes in a much more standard anime type format, which was a first for its time, and actually, it does really well with the Halo franchise, and we were surprised with not only how good this episode looked, but how it uses visual storytelling through the art style to maybe push the narrative even further along. Now, this story has to do with runaway Spartans in a flashback form who tried to escape and go back to their homes, only to find the dark secret that Oni had done to replace them with clones to their families who weren't really that good of clones, and the Spartans had to deal with the dark truth of the reality that they were living in. And while it's a very short and self-contained story through and through, it was a very interesting and unique story that hadn't been explored in the Halo franchise yet. Because of that, and a mix of the good-looking production and the art style, we are going to go ahead and put this one surprisingly all the way up in A tier. Similarly, there were two other episodes that also stood out in Halo Legends, specifically Prototype, which definitely is a much darker tone, surprisingly, from Homecoming, which has the story of a Marine commander using some prototype armor to not only buy civilians, but also his fellow Marines some extra time, and it's just kind of a cool sequence that could have just been like focused on some Michael Bay level action through and through, but they did tie it in with some interesting personal growth stories with the character, which was something cool. They did, of course, have a character who literally goes by the name Ghost, which does sound a little cliche, but if you remember that this actually came out way before the Modern Warfare 2 days of having a character named Ghost, or a video game called Ghosts, or just other games that had done the term Ghost a lot. It was a little more unique for its time, and it still is a pretty interesting episode, so we're putting this one in A tier as well. And also the episode The Babysitter, which follows a bunch of ODSTs who are sent on this mission to assassinate a Covenant leader, and they are joined by a Spartan, and it's easy to follow, where some other things that have come out of the Halo franchise are more confusing and not very polished in its storytelling. Okay, then one of the episodes was a non-canon episode, so it doesn't actually exist in the Halo canon, but it was Odd One Out, and it's just a satirical interpretation of the Halo universe, and we follow a Spartan known as Spartan 1337, and honestly, for what it's worth, this episode probably could have been a canon episode and it wouldn't have hurt the existing Halo lore anyways. And surprisingly enough, while it was goofy at times, it was still a fun change of pace for Halo Legends, so we're gonna go ahead and put this one in B tier. Okay, and then the big finale of Halo Legends was definitely the episode The Package, and we don't even know where to begin with this one, because even before we sat down and rewatched this for this video, I can say right now, this is one of my least favorite things in the entire Halo franchise. There's so much to hate about it, and at the same time, it's kind of the greatest thing that we've ever seen from the Halo franchise. There's just so much wrong with it that in a way it's kind of amazing, and even some cool moments tied in the middle of it that redeem some of the really bad moments, but those really bad moments are really bad. This is going to be a confusing one. Essentially, we see Master Chief and Blue Team on some mission, and for a while we see some of the Spartans at the beginning without their helmets on, except Master Chief, of course. One of them looks like they inspired the Fortnite franchise, maybe. Then next thing we know, they're riding on these space motorcycles or something. There's a bunch of action sequences. There's a bunch of stuff going on. Master Chief goes on and ends up saving Catherine Halsey, which marks the debut of this character in a visual format. And they obviously didn't pay attention to the lore because Halsey's already supposed to be like a middle-aged woman at this point. I mean, maybe even a little younger, but definitely not this. And then there's a bunch of Halo references sprinkled in there like we wouldn't know that this was already Halo media. And it's so on the nose that it's cringeworthy, but then it's so cringeworthy that it kind of inverts into this great level. I don't know. They went over the top with the CGI, and the CGI definitely does not hold up today. There's some over the top action sequences that definitely don't hold up today. And like I said, this thing is just all over the place, and because of that, it's kind of amazing. So while we don't know whether or not this goes into S tier or this should go into something below F tier, we're gonna give it its own rank and just put it in X tier because it has this X factor about it that is just beyond anything you could ever imagine. Okay, and then there's this very obscure Halo series that exists out there that a lot of you may not even know about, but it's called Apartment 117, or at least it was supposed to be a series. It's technically lost media nowadays because only the first episode was ever listed on Halo Waypoint before the show was practically immediately canceled. But essentially a short animated series which would have followed some regular average dude named Jeff who lives with a Halo obsessed fan named Micah in an apartment known as Apartment 117, and it's just this awkward day-to-day interaction that Jeff has with his roommate who just really likes Halo. And I don't know, it's pretty bizarre. It apparently released to not great feedback across the board, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, after the first episode was posted onto Halo Waypoint, it had a very, very short run, and it was removed just a couple of days later for an undisclosed reason. Still, episode 1 exists online, and watching it back, we were kind of surprised how poorly it was received when it released, considering it had the same sense of humor of pretty much anything you would see online back in the 2010 type days. Maybe it's a little bit more feeling like a 2007 type sense of humor than a 2010 sense of humor, but apparently there may still be episodes out there somewhere that had never released, so it would be interesting to see what the series would have been and if the series would have become more popular as more episodes could have released had those episodes ended up releasing. Nonetheless though, the first episode was an interesting watch. There's a couple of clever Halo Easter eggs that are a little bit on the nose but fun nonetheless, and there's some just really dry and dumb humor, and it wasn't the worst thing we had seen all night considering we had to watch The Package, so we're actually gonna feel comfortable at least with putting this one up at B tier, but we would really recommend you guys go and watch the animation for yourself. It's pretty short, and then maybe let us know what you ended up thinking about this series just because it's so out there and it's turbulent history that it has. Do you think it's really as bad as maybe it was called out to be back in the day, or do you think it actually was kind of okay? And then lastly, there is Halo Landfall, which back in the day was a super big deal just because it was one of the first times that Halo was ever looked at in a realistic live action type setting, and it was really awesome to watch. It was actually directed by Neil Blomkamp, who was supposed to make a Halo live action film, but when that fell through, he ended up making making District 9, which was a great film. But this one became very important for the Halo community because it set the bar to an extent as to what action sequences can look like in a live action setting. And it was really awesome to see. Now obviously, since we're comparing this though to every form of Halo media we've seen so far, it doesn't have the narrative focus or even really individual characters that have some sort of plot associated with them. But those action sequences and just seeing the Halo stuff brought to life was so cool back in the day, and it's still really cool to look at now, that this one is going into B tier. Now, interestingly enough though, this ended up having a really big legacy when it came to Halo, just with how a lot of the live action trailers and commercials that would come later on would kind of look. And with that, a lot of the commercials that drew inspiration from Landfall's legacy ended up being some of our most favorite types of Halo media that we've ever seen, even if they're too short to necessarily be classified as a short film, and really they're just abbreviated commercials. But still, they definitely do get honorable mentions because they are pretty cool. Now, this wasn't something that we had initially expected to have come out of our tier list, but looking at our list, obviously there is a big blank when it comes to S tier. And we kind of were faced with two options. We could have scaled things and just tried to pick our favorites from the A tier and pick one or two and put them up in the S tier, but it would feel a little disingenuous because for the most part, we feel like across the board, the Halo franchise hasn't had any type of movie or TV show equivalent that has been made in a flawless form where you can look at it and see it as a masterpiece just yet. And it's definitely something that we feel the Halo franchise could have if a Halo project was just given enough backing and support with a clear goal and focus in mind. We're still optimistic that it can be done. Maybe the new Halo TV series will be the first entry in the S tier, but we also wanted to kind of use this as a form of an illustration. If we could pick and include everything across the Halo franchise when it comes to media that's not the games or the books, there would be a couple key things from over the years that we would have put into the S tier if we felt like they could fall under the same category as this video topic. Like for instance, Sadie's story from ODST easily would have been placed in S tier, also alongside Hunt the Truth Season 1 from the pre-marketing for Halo 5 Guardians. If Deliver Hope was longer and could classify as a short film, we probably would have counted Deliver Hope in the S tier as well, just because of how cool and polished that entire trailer sequence was. So these are just examples of things that can come out and release that are super polished and well put together, that are deserving of that S tier. We just haven't quite seen it happen in the movie or television format yet. But obviously a lot of you are probably going to disagree with our opinions on some of these, so if you did, leave a comment down below with how you would rearrange your tier list. But if you enjoyed this video either way, make sure you hit the like button and also subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss any more videos in the future. That's it for today though. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.